There exists within the human population a small percentage of individuals who possess an extraordinary capacity for psychological perception that goes far beyond ordinary social awareness. These individuals do not merely pick up on obvious emotional cues or read basic body language. They perceive the hidden psychological currents that flow beneath everyday interactions, sensing unspoken tensions, detecting unconscious motivations, and witnessing the complex interplay of forces that most people never consciously register. Carl Jung encountered these individuals throughout his clinical practice and recognized in them something that transcended typical psychological categorization. He observed that their heightened perceptual abilities, rather than being a blessing, often became the source of profound suffering and social isolation. These were not people experiencing mental illness or delusion. They were individuals whose consciousness operated at a level of refinement that made ordinary social participation extraordinarily difficult. The phenomenon begins with what appears to be a gift. Imagine walking into a room and immediately knowing who is struggling with hidden depression despite their cheerful exterior. Picture sensing the precise moment when someone begins to lie, feeling it as a subtle shift in the psychological atmosphere. Consider being able to predict with uncanny accuracy which relationships will fail, which business ventures will collapse, which individuals are heading toward personal crisis, all based on psychological patterns that remain invisible to everyone else. This might sound like a superpower, something to be envied and cultivated. But Jung discovered through careful observation that this level of perception comes with costs that few people understand or anticipate. The individuals who possess these abilities often find themselves trapped in a reality that no one else can see or validate, leading to a form of existential isolation that goes beyond mere loneliness. During the period following his professional separation from Sigmund Freud, Jung encountered a particularly instructive case that would shape his understanding of this phenomenon. A woman came to him presenting symptoms that defied conventional psychiatric classification. She was highly educated, articulate, and showed no signs of psychosis or neurological dysfunction. Yet she described experiencing life in a way that made normal functioning nearly impossible. She reported being unable to engage in casual conversation because she could sense the psychological undercurrents beneath every word. When someone asked how she was doing, she did not just hear the question. She felt their actual level of interest, their hidden anxieties about her potential response, their unconscious hope that she would say she was fine so they could move on. She perceived the complex web of social contracts and unconscious agreements that allow superficial interactions to function, and she found herself unable to participate in these elaborate psychological dances. In professional settings, her presence seemed to create disruption without her saying or doing anything unusual. Colleagues became uncomfortable around her, though they could not articulate why. Supervisors found reasons to reassign her or let her go, always with vague explanations about fit or team dynamics. She had not created any actual problems, but her very presence seemed to disturb something fundamental in group psychology. Jung recognized that he was observing something beyond individual pathology. This woman possessed what he would come to call differentiated intuitive perception, an ability to consciously access information that normally remains in the unconscious realm. She was not imagining these perceptions. When Jung carefully verified her observations about other people, they proved remarkably accurate. She could describe hidden aspects of individuals that Jung himself had discovered only through lengthy analysis. The implications of this discovery were profound and, in Jung's view, dangerous. If some individuals could naturally perceive unconscious contents that others could not access, what did this mean for human psychology and social organization? How could society function if some of its members could see through the collective agreements and shared illusions that maintain social cohesion? Jung began to document specific ways this heightened perception manifested in everyday situations. One patient described being unable to shop in crowded stores because she absorbed the stress, frustration, and desperation of other shoppers so intensely that she would leave feeling physically ill. Another reported that he could not attend family gatherings because he was overwhelmed by the unspoken resentments, old wounds, and hidden conflicts that pervaded every interaction, even when everyone appeared to be getting along pleasantly on the surface. These experiences went far beyond normal empathy or social sensitivity. These individuals were perceiving actual psychological contents that existed below the threshold of ordinary consciousness. They were not projecting their own issues onto others or imagining problems where none existed. They were accurately detecting real psychological dynamics that most people successfully kept hidden, even from themselves. Modern research into highly sensitive persons and sensory processing sensitivity has validated many of Jung's observations. Scientists have identified that approximately 15 to 20% of the population possesses nervous systems that process sensory and emotional information with greater depth and intensity. But within this broader category, Jung identified something more specific and rare, affecting perhaps 1 to 2% of people. These individuals do not just process information more deeply. They perceive patterns and connections that exist below the threshold of ordinary consciousness. The neurological basis for this phenomenon appears to involve differences in how these brains process and integrate information. While most people filter out massive amounts of sensory and psychological data to focus on immediate practical concerns, these individuals seem to lack some of these filtering mechanisms. They take in more information, process it more thoroughly, and detect patterns that others miss entirely. This might seem like an evolutionary advantage, and in some contexts it certainly can be. These individuals often excel in fields requiring deep psychological insight, pattern recognition, or the ability to sense what is not being explicitly communicated. They become therapists, counselors, artists, writers, and healers. But the same sensitivity that allows for these gifts also creates vulnerabilities that can be devastating. Jung identified several distinct patterns in how this heightened perception manifests. Some individuals primarily experience it through emotional channels. They absorb the feelings of those around them so completely that they struggle to distinguish their own emotional states from those they have unconsciously taken on from their environment. A person with this pattern might wake up feeling fine, spend an hour in a crowded space, and leave carrying the accumulated anxiety, depression, and anger of dozens of strangers, all without conscious awareness of what has happened. Jung documented a case of a man who had experienced sudden rage while driving, only to realize later that he had absorbed the road rage of drivers around him. He was not an angry person by nature, but his psychological boundaries were so permeable that he became a conduit for the unexpressed emotions of others. This created immense confusion about his own identity and emotional life. Others experience heightened perception, primarily through cognitive channels. They see patterns and connections with startling clarity, often predicting outcomes that seem impossible to foresee. These individuals might know that a seemingly happy couple will divorce within a year, that a successful business will fail, or that someone who appears healthy is developing a serious illness. They perceive these things not through magical thinking, but through unconscious pattern recognition that processes thousands of subtle cues below the threshold of conscious awareness. Jung wrote about a patient who could predict stock market movements with uncanny accuracy, not through analytical methods, but through sensing the collective psychological currents that drove market behavior. This ability brought him wealth, but also profound isolation, as he could never explain his insights in ways others could understand or accept. Still others experience this perception through somatic channels, feeling in their own bodies the physical states of those around them. They might experience sudden fatigue when near someone who is exhausted but hiding it, feel physical pain that belongs to another person, or sense illness before symptoms become apparent. This somatic sensitivity can be so intense that being in groups becomes physically overwhelming. Jung documented a nurse who could diagnose patients by feeling their symptoms in her own body. When she stood near someone with liver problems, she would feel pain in her own liver area. When treating someone with heart disease, she would experience cardiac symptoms. While this made her extraordinarily effective as a healer, it also meant she was constantly experiencing physical suffering that was not her own. The most challenging pattern involves those who experience all of these forms of perception simultaneously without adequate psychological structures to organize and process the information. These individuals live in a state of constant overwhelm, bombarded by psychological, emotional, and somatic information from their environment, with no effective way to filter or organize it. Jung observed that regardless of the specific pattern, all of these individuals faced similar challenges. The first and most immediate was social isolation. When you perceive things that others cannot or will not acknowledge, every interaction becomes complicated. You cannot simply engage in small talk when you are aware of the deeper psychological dynamics at play. You cannot pretend not to notice when someone is lying, suffering, or heading toward crisis. This creates a terrible bind. If you speak about what you perceive, people become defensive, uncomfortable, or hostile. They may accuse you of being negative, creating problems, or projecting your own issues onto them. If you remain silent, you feel inauthentic and disconnected, unable to form genuine relationships while pretending not to see what is obvious to you. Jung documented numerous cases where highly perceptive individuals became scapegoats in their families, workplaces, and social groups. They were blamed for problems they had merely observed, accused of creating conflicts that already existed beneath the surface. This pattern was so consistent that Jung came to see it as an almost inevitable consequence of superior perception in an unconscious world. One particularly striking case involved a woman who was repeatedly fired from jobs for being disruptive, despite never engaging in any objectively problematic behavior. Her mere presence seemed to activate unconscious contents in her coworkers, bringing hidden conflicts to the surface. Rather than recognizing that she was simply reflecting existing dynamics, groups consistently identified her as the source of problems. The mechanism behind this scapegoating is psychological projection. When someone's unconscious contents are reflected back to them through another person's perception, the ego experiences this as a threat. Rather than acknowledge and integrate these unconscious aspects, it is psychologically easier to attack the person who reflects them. A highly perceptive individual becomes a living mirror that shows people aspects of themselves they are not ready to see. This dynamic extends beyond individual relationships to group psychology. Jung observed that highly perceptive individuals often disrupted what he called collective unconscious agreements. Every group, whether a family, workplace, or society, maintains itself partly through shared unconscious contracts about will and will not be acknowledged. The person who sees too clearly violates these contracts simply by existing authentically. For example, a family might maintain its cohesion through an unconscious agreement to ignore the father's alcoholism, the mother's depression, or the underlying dysfunction in their relationships. A highly perceptive child in such a family does not need to say anything to become a problem. Their mere presence, their inability to participate naturally in the collective denial, marks them as different and potentially dangerous to the family system. Jung documented how these children often developed physical symptoms, behavioral problems, or psychological issues that served to deflect attention from the family's real problems. They became the identified patient, the one who carried the symptoms of the entire family system. This was not conscious manipulation, but an unconscious process whereby the group projected its pathology onto the member who could not participate in collective denial. Jung identified another danger that was perhaps even more serious than social isolation. He observed that people with heightened perception often lost contact with their own psychological boundaries. They absorbed so much psychological material from their environment that they could no longer distinguish between their own thoughts, feelings, and sensations and those they had taken on from others. This boundary dissolution could lead to what Jung called participation mystique, a state where individual consciousness becomes merged with collective unconscious contents. The person no longer exists as a distinct psychological entity, but becomes a kind of psychological sponge, absorbing and expressing whatever unconscious material is present in their environment. Jung witnessed cases where this led to complete psychological breakdown. Individuals became so overwhelmed by undifferentiated psychological contents that they could no longer function. They might experience rapid mood swings that reflected the emotional states of people around them, have thoughts that belonged to others, or feel physical symptoms that had no basis in their own bodies. One patient Jung treated would literally take on the personalities of people she spent time with, unconsciously mimicking their speech patterns, gestures, and even their psychological complexes. She had so little sense of her own identity that she became whoever she was with, losing herself completely in the process. The danger was not just psychological, but existential. These individuals risked losing their very sense of self, their core identity dissolving into an ocean of collective unconscious material. Jung saw this as one of the most serious risks facing anyone with heightened perceptual abilities. Given these dangers, Jung developed a systematic approach to help highly perceptive individuals not only survive, but thrive with their abilities. He called this the individuation process, a journey towards psychological wholeness that required conscious integration of both personal and collective unconscious contents. The first step in this process involved learning to differentiate between one's own psychological contents and absorbed material from the environment. Jung taught his patients to spend regular time in complete solitude, allowing the psychological noise from others to settle so they could recognize their own authentic inner voice. This was not about becoming antisocial, but about establishing a clear sense of personal psychological boundaries. Jung developed specific exercises for this differentiation process. He would have patients keep detailed journals documenting their emotional and psychological states at different times and in different environments. By tracking patterns over time, they could begin to identify which experiences were genuinely their own and which were absorbed from external sources. Jung emphasized the importance of creative expression as a way to process and discharge accumulated psychological material. Through art, writing, music, or other creative outlets, highly perceptive individuals could transform the overwhelming input they received into something constructive. This creative process served as a kind of psychological digestion, breaking down and reorganizing unconscious contents into forms that could be consciously integrated. He particularly advocated for what he called active imagination, a technique where individuals would engage consciously with unconscious material through visualization, dialogue, or creative expression. This allowed them to process psychological contents without being overwhelmed by them, maintaining conscious awareness while exploring unconscious depths. Another crucial element involved shadow work, the process of recognizing and integrating one's own unconscious aspects. Jung observed that highly perceptive individuals often projected their own shadow onto others, becoming disturbed by qualities in others that they had not acknowledged in themselves. The more completely one could accept their own capacity for all human experiences and behaviors, the less disturbing it became to perceive these in others. Jung developed a specific approach to shadow work for highly perceptive individuals. Rather than seeing their perception of others' shadows as purely external observation, he encouraged them to ask what each perception might reveal about their own unconscious contents. This created a practice of simultaneous external perception and internal reflection that prevented projection while maintaining perceptive clarity. Jung also stressed the importance of finding what he called conscious relationships. These were connections with other individuals who had achieved some degree of psychological consciousness and could, engage with heightened perception without defensiveness. These relationships were rare, but essential for psychological health. They provided validation, understanding, and the opportunity for authentic connection that highly perceptive individuals desperately needed. He observed that these relationships often formed quickly and intensely when two highly conscious individuals met. There was an immediate recognition, a sense of finding another member of what Jung called the psychological elite, not in terms of superiority, but in terms of conscious development. These connections provided crucial support for the challenging work of individuation. The individuation process was not about eliminating heightened perception or learning to fit into unconscious collective patterns. It was about developing the psychological strength and sophistication to hold these perceptive abilities consciously, using them constructively while maintaining personal boundaries and authentic identity. Jung studied historical figures who had successfully navigated the challenges of heightened perception. He was particularly interested in individuals who had transformed their perceptive abilities into gifts that served both personal development and collective evolution. These included mystics who channeled their insights into spiritual teachings, artists who expressed psychological truths through their work, and healers who used their perception to help others achieve psychological integration. He contrasted these successful examples with cases of individuals whose superior perception had led to breakdown or destruction. The difference, Jung observed, lay not in the degree of perception, but in the relationship to it. Those who identified completely with their perceptive abilities, seeing themselves as special or superior, often experienced inflation followed by collapse. Those who held their abilities more lightly, as tools rather than identity, were more likely to achieve successful integration. Jung himself went through a period of overwhelming perception during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. Following his break with Freud, he experienced an influx of psychological material that threatened to overwhelm his conscious personality. He documented this period in his Red Book, describing visions, dreams, and psychological experiences that pushed him to the edge of what he could consciously contain. His survival and eventual integration of these experiences shaped his understanding of the individuation process. He recognized that overwhelming perception was not pathological, but potentially evolutionary, representing consciousness attempting to expand beyond current limitations. The key was not to resist or suppress these experiences, but to develop the psychological capacity to hold them consciously. Jung believed that highly perceptive individuals served an essential function in collective human development. They were what he called consciousness pioneers, individuals whose psychological development preceded collective readiness. Their struggles and eventual integration of expanded consciousness created pathways that others would eventually follow. He observed that throughout history, individuals with heightened perception had appeared at crucial junctures in human development. They sensed new possibilities before they became apparent to collective consciousness, identified problems before they became critical, and pointed toward solutions that seemed impossible until they were actualized. In the modern context, Jung suggested that highly perceptive individuals might be sensing psychological patterns related to technological development, environmental crisis, social transformation, and spiritual evolution that collective consciousness was not yet ready to acknowledge. Their personal struggles with integration were actually collective struggles being worked out in individual psychology. This perspective transformed the meaning of heightened perception from a personal burden to a collective responsibility. The highly perceptive individual was not cursed, but called to a particular form of service. Not service in the sense of sacrificing oneself for others, but service through achieving the fullest possible development of one's own consciousness. Jung warned against several pitfalls that could derail this development. The first was what he called inflation, where individuals became identified with their perceptive abilities and saw themselves as superior to others. This led to arrogance, isolation, and eventual psychological collapse when the ego could no longer sustain the inflated position. Another pitfall involved using heightened perception as justification for withdrawal from life. Some individuals convinced themselves that others were too unconscious to bother with, retreating into isolation that they justified as spiritual superiority. Jung saw this as a failure of individuation, a retreat from the challenge of conscious engagement with unconscious world. A third danger involved becoming addicted to the helper role, defining oneself entirely through the ability to perceive and assist others. This created a different form of psychological imbalance where personal development was sacrificed to constant focus on others' psychological material. Jung emphasized that integration was not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing process requiring constant conscious attention. Even successfully integrated individuals could experience periods of overwhelm, especially during times of stress, transition, or when exposed to particularly intense collective unconscious contents. He developed practical strategies for maintaining healthy integration over time. These included regular practices of solitude and reflection to maintain contact with one's own psychological center, conscious choices about when and how to engage perceptive abilities rather than being constantly open to all psychological input, ongoing creative expression to process and transform accumulated psychological material, connection with others who could provide support, validation, and reality testing, and perhaps most importantly, maintaining what Jung called a symbolic attitude, the ability to see psychological contents as meaningful but not literal, important but not absolute. Jung's vision for highly perceptive individuals was neither romantic nor pessimistic. He saw the challenges clearly, but also recognized the potential for these individuals to achieve extraordinary psychological development. Through conscious integration of their perceptive abilities, they could become bridges between conscious and unconscious, individual and collective, current reality and future possibility. The ultimate achievement of individuation for the highly perceptive person was not to transcend their sensitivity, but to embody it fully while maintaining psychological balance. This meant being able to perceive deeply without being overwhelmed, to see clearly without judgment, to understand profoundly without needing to fix or save everyone. Jung described this state as one of conscious participation in the collective unconscious. The individuated person could engage with collective psychological contents without losing their individual identity, serve collective development without sacrificing personal wholeness, and hold space for unconscious material to become conscious without being destroyed by the process. This level of integration required not just psychological work, but spiritual development. Jung saw individuation as ultimately a spiritual journey, not in a religious sense, but in terms of connecting with something greater than personal ego, while maintaining individual consciousness. The highly perceptive person who achieved this integration became what Jung called a whole person, someone who had realized their unique potential while remaining connected to collective humanity. The implications of Jung's work with highly perceptive individuals extend far beyond individual psychology. If consciousness evolution depends on individuals who can perceive beyond current collective limitations, then supporting these individuals becomes essential for collective development. Rather than pathologizing sensitivity or trying to help highly perceptive people fit into unconscious patterns, we might need to recognize their struggles as growing pains of expanding consciousness. Jung's work suggests that the isolation and suffering experienced by highly perceptive individuals is not inevitable, but results from the gap between individual and collective consciousness development. As collective consciousness evolves, what once seemed like overwhelming sensitivity might become recognized as normal or even necessary perception. The journey from dangerous perception to integrated wisdom is neither simple nor easy. It requires courage to face one's own shadow, strength to maintain boundaries while remaining open, wisdom to know when to speak and when to remain silent, and compassion for both oneself and others struggling with unconscious patterns. For those who recognize themselves in these descriptions, Jung's work offers both validation and direction. Your heightened perception is not a malfunction or illness, but a variation in consciousness that comes with both gifts and challenges. The path forward is not about eliminating your sensitivity or pretending to be less conscious than you are. It is about developing the psychological sophistication to hold your perceptive abilities consciously and constructively. This means learning to distinguish between your own psychological contents and what you absorb from others. It means developing creative outlets for processing overwhelming input. It means finding others who can meet you at your level of consciousness without defense or projection. It means accepting the responsibility that comes with seeing clearly while releasing the need to save everyone from their unconsciousness. Most importantly, it means recognizing that your struggle with integration is not just personal but collective. You are working out in individual psychology what humanity as a whole will eventually need to address. Your successful integration creates pathways that others will follow, even if they never know your name or recognize your contribution. Jung's most profound insight about highly perceptive individuals was that their greatest danger was also their greatest opportunity. The very sensitivity that threatened to destroy them could, if properly integrated, transform them into exactly what humanity needs for its continued evolution. Not saviors or prophets, but conscious individuals who have learned to bridge the gap between what is and what is becoming. The challenge is not to see less, but to see wisely. Not to feel less, but to feel consciously. Not to perceive less, but to engage more skillfully with what you perceive. This is the path Jung outlined, a path that leads not to normal adjustment, but to extraordinary development. Not to fitting in, but to standing out in service of collective evolution. Your heightened perception is not your burden, but your calling. Your sensitivity is not your weakness, but your strength waiting to be consciously developed. Your ability to see everything is not a curse, but a gift that requires careful cultivation. The world needs what you can see, but it needs it delivered with the wisdom, compassion, and strategic intelligence that come from conscious integration. The journey from overwhelming perception to integrated wisdom is the hero's journey of consciousness itself. It is a path that few are called to walk and fewer still complete. But for those who undertake this journey with commitment and consciousness, the reward is not just personal healing, but the opportunity to serve consciousness evolution in ways that ripple out far beyond individual life. This is Jung's most dangerous discovery, that consciousness evolution depends on individuals who can bear the burden of seeing clearly in an unconscious world and transform that burden into a gift through the alchemy of individuation. The danger is real, but so is the potential for transformation. The choice, as always, belongs to the individual who sees.